Good day. The easiest way to evaluate your behavioral interviewing skills would be how well can you answer failure questions. Okay, and in this video I'm going to share with you a number of scenarios of the most common formulations of these failure questions, as well as some mistakes to avoid and what brings your answers from good to great. Okay, scenario number one, the most common formulation would be, what's your most recent failure? Okay, and what happens here is that most candidates would be inclined to read a bit too much between the lines and refer to, hey, what is the most recent thing I failed at, right? Now, if you want to bring this to an extreme, there's even some candidates who like presenting their most recent failure as, I cannot pass job interviews. Okay, so obviously this would be a terrible example, simply because, you know, it's not work related. It doesn't sell you as a qualified candidate by any means, right? But most of the time what candidates would do here would be to think about what is the most recent failure I had versus what's the best failure I can share with my interviewer. Okay, so in other words, instead of presenting your best story, you would present your second or your third best failure story, simply because of the recency, simply because of the formulation of this interview question, right? So in my experience, your best failure story can usually be sold as a recent one, simply because of its importance, right? So even if your best failure story happened 1 year ago, that will still could qualify as recent, so long as you have some interesting learnings to share with them, and so long as it's an amazing story. Okay, so first one, the formulation around recency. The second scenario I'd like to share with you here would be what I call a setup. Okay, so basically it would be a pair of two questions leading up to a failure question. So for example, what makes you smile? Okay, a rather personal story. Many candidates would answer this, hey, my family, my kids, you know, these sort of things. And you know, you get on a more positive, on a more personal line on the interview. And then after asking you this question of what makes you smile, right, rather easy, personal question, okay, but have you had any shortcomings as of recently? And this is a true story. Actually, I use this in some of my coaching sessions. I had this pair of questions with one candidate, and what happened is that they say, yes, then actually, you know, I had in my job I failed, you know, like last year I failed my goals, this year I failed also, and I hate my manager, and I feel like, you know, it's time to move on from this role. So what the candidate did was basically they opened up to me, and they presented me with all their failures and the underlying cause for them willing to leave their current role. They presented me not one but three failures, right? They didn't present it to me as an experience from which they grew, but they just opened up, right? So this was for a principal AI scientist role with a major FANG company. Okay, so it can happen with very senior types of roles, and you can imagine the moment you open up too much in job interviews, that will rarely be to your advantage, and simply because there's no such thing as a perfect candidate, as there's no such thing as a perfect job, right? So what you should do, you know, you should keep a cautiously optimistic attitude throughout the interview, which is a professional, a very formal encounter, even though some interviewers might like to call this an informal experience, right? So long story short, don't open up with your failure questions if you have some events that you cannot easily get over with, and don't give them three failure stories if they only ask you for one. Okay, and the third scenario I'd like to share with you here would be, for the interview question, tell me about a challenging situation that you had to resolve. And what happens here is there's a tendency for some candidates to present a challenging situation as a failure story. So there is this misinterpretation that a challenging situation would be a failure story, which in my opinion it's a mistake. it's a significant mistake, because in job interviews, unless you're asked, you should never present with a failure story, whereas a challenging situation should be one where you sell yourself on some successful outcome, right? You sell yourself on your strengths, right? The only reason why you would present a failure story would be for its learnings. Okay, so that would be the most compelling, but usually in job interviews talk about positive stories, stories of how you sell yourself as the better candidate, right? Now, I presented you all these scenarios where people go wrong about answering these failure questions. Now, what makes a great answer to a failure question? Simply put, that would be a story with some great learnings. Okay, so if you think about the STAR format, if you want a great structure for your failure stories, it would be to present the situation and task and action as 50% of your answer, and then the result to be the learnings and to be the other 50% of your answer, right? So what I'm recommending you, what I'm suggesting you here would be to focus on presenting some interesting learnings for 50% of the time you speak about a failure in a job interview. And in my experience, this will raise some interesting bells with many of the candidates, because you would, most of the time, the learnings from failure stories are not necessarily inexistent, but rather a one-liner, you know. And this is how I learned the importance of prioritization, and that's it, right? Whereas in my experience, if you spend a bit of time to brainstorm for some interesting learnings that would also connect with the type of role you're applying for, that would be the best possible combination, right? The second ingredient of a great answer to failure questions would be when you focus on your professional experience, right? So remember the example, I failed my previous job interview. You know, that's not something you can sell yourself on. This doesn't make sense. Or I'm sure you had, you know, some non-professional failures from which you grew as a human being, but this rarely sells you as the best candidate for the role, except, you know, if it's some niche type of scenario, right? Also, people like to choose their failure stories, the impact of the failure based on their interviewing skills and based on their motivation, right? So basically, if you're just getting started, you're a fresher, people are inclined to speak about smaller failures, insignificant ones. I mean, not necessarily insignificant, but ones which were not career-ending, so to speak, right? Whereas people who are confident in their interviewing skills and people for more senior types of roles would likely focus on some failures with some major impact, you know, where there was some serious damage done in their role, or they even got fired, and that's how they learn the importance of whatever, right? But if you want some of the best types of answers I got were people who could use failures to sell themselves, even for challenge questions, for challenge situations. So remember previously I talked about some candidates say that, hey, what's your most challenging situation? They talk about the failure. But there's candidates who can sell themselves on challenging situations from which they grew so much, as if it would be a great learning experience and a great way to sell themselves during job interviews. It's, in my experience, less than 3% of candidates who can do this. But yes, it's possible that you can sell yourself even on your failure stories, even without getting asked, right? But this is, quite exceptional, right? But long story short, failure questions are used, in their most basic format, are used to see, to check on whether candidates did prepare for job interviews in the first place. And there's a whole hierarchical procedure to determine how skillful a candidate is in behavioral interviews, just on how well they can answer these interview questions, right? I do this for around 7 years now, and it's always worked to determine the proficiency of an interview candidate with behavioral interviews solely based on their ability to answer failure questions, right? So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.